Ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome our speaker today, Jim Hornfischer.
Almost immediately, a shell struck that station in the after mainmast, killing Hubbard and all the men around him. The first lieutenant, Schoenland, down deep in Central Station, ordered the ship's steering and engine control shifted to the conning tower, an armored compartment just forward of the bridge. And that's where Bruce McCandless took the con. In the intervening time, the bridge was hit again and heavily. On the starboard side of the flag bridge, McCandless came to his senses and found the bodies of Admiral Callahan and 3 other officers on his staff. A 4th member of his staff, Emmett O'Byrne, was unconscious but alive, the only survivor on Callahan's flag staff. McCandless's training had never prepared him for the vertigo and shock of this butchery. Bodies helmeted and life-jacketed, limbs and gear littered the deck. He told Schoenland down in Central Station that he thought he might be the only officer alive on the bridge. That made Schoenland the ship's senior officer, but down below deck, Schoenland, as first lieutenant down at Central Station, found himself quickly consumed with the task of controlling the flooding that was threatening to sink or capsize the ship. McCandless asked him, "What are your orders?" And Schoenland said, stay topside, take the con, you worry about life topside, and I'll take matters in my own hands down here. The magazines and other forward compartments were flooding, and additional water pumped aboard by the firefighting crews added to the problem. The San Francisco had at least 25 fires burning within her. You can now see the problem. The firefighting was rather necessary, but the water from the hoses was washing down onto the second deck, which was high enough to cause stability problems. And as the ship turned, the water rushed to one side or the other, causing what they call a free surface effect, threatening to capsize the ship with every turn. The ship really had no damage below the waterline, but the water was nonetheless threatening to sink her, as well as the fires. And so this is where Schoenland, who was later decorated very highly for his actions, came up with a really crucial insight. He realized that he was going to have to get this water out of here, but he'd have to improvise as there were no pumps on the second deck. And so what he did was he used mattresses and whatever else was handy to close off certain passageways and to shunt the water that would rush down. He was planning to drain the water out of the second deck into the ship's lower compartments. And he was able to basically improvise a system of sluice gates using mattresses and that kind of thing to open up flooded compartments, drain the water out, let the water rush down the passageways, kind of shunted by the mattresses to other compartments that had drains to lower decks where there were pumps. And so basically this is why Chief Johnny is standing here today. Because we had ingenious men. Damage control was a hallmark of the US fleet all through the war, and it was this kind of improvisation that was yet another hallmark. And just an incredible thing to drill into and understand how these men saved their ship. We can thank a great many of them, but Schoenland, as tends to happen, the officer gets the credit. And so we're talking about him today. So basically the battle, both fleets spend themselves against each other for a couple of hours. They make a pass, and eventually the fleets pass each other at close range. The base units, so-called, the larger ships in each line, take their turn battering each other, and then everybody's left to reckon with what's just happened. And it takes a while for McCandless and the other surviving Americans to figure out who was in command. Eventually they managed to rejoin with the other surviving US ships, the Helena, the Juno, and several destroyers, and begin to withdraw from the battle area. The senior officer of the survivors, Captain Hoover of the Helena, finds himself as commander of this damaged task force. On request from Commander McCandless, the Juno sent one of her medical officers and several corpsmen over to the San Francisco to assist with the wounded. And just before dawn, the San Francisco's senior enlisted men reported topside to join for a gruesome ritual that I referred to earlier, the so-called body part sweep. Its purpose was to cleanse the ship of the remains of deceased crew. It's really not pleasant to talk about after a meal, so I'll skip some detail. But they wash down the ship's surfaces and make her presentable for entry into harbor. As with abandoning a ship, it wasn't something that could be done or really rehearsed ahead of time, and the decision to choose senior rates for the detail was aimed really at morale. This kind of duty was not lightly undertaken, and certainly not by your new seaman, second class. And so, the losses on the San Francisco were around 100 men. But they didn't die in vain, because as all this is going on, the pilots from Henderson Field, who have been spared bombardment, thanks to Admiral Callahan's interception of those battleships, the battleships were coming to bombard the airfield and the Marines on the island. Thanks to Admiral Callahan, the pilots were able to fly come rise of morning. And when they took off, they had quite a view of the remnants of the previous night's activities. Here's the Japanese battleship PA with a busted rudder circling and burning east of Savo Island. Here's several destroyers and cruisers. The Atlanta's on fire, dead in the water. They drop her anchor so she won't drift ashore. She's eventually taken under by her fires and the flooding. Several destroyers shoot it out. The Portland has got a busted rudder as well, circling over near Tulagi. The Portland actually sinks a Japanese cripple with her main battery while circling, rather a remarkable feat of naval marksmanship. And several destroyers fire on one another. But it's the Marine aviators from Guadalcanal who end the show, swarming down the Japanese battleships and the survivors and putting them out of business. And later, in the coming days, the aviators will find that the Japanese troop transports idling in the north. They're holding most of the 38th Division, Japanese Imperial Army, waiting to land in Guadalcanal. And thanks again to Admiral Callahan, those transports are never cleared to come in and land, and the aviators find the transports and sink the majority of them along with the aforementioned infantry division. And so walking backward through these events, we find the campaign's moment of truth here, this frightful naval battle on Friday, November 13th, 1942, that Admiral Daniel Callahan gave his life to win. The Americans absorbed terrible losses, 4 destroyers, the cruisers Atlanta and Juno, and about 1,000 sailors. But the effect of the loss of the Hiei on the Japanese was catastrophic to their morale. This was Emperor Hirohito's favorite ship, sort of akin to the British emotions toward the HMS Hood. The Americans had similar feelings in retrospect towards the Arizona. It was just one of the emotional connections. It was one of the famous ships in the Japanese Navy. The loss of the Hiei struck their command powerfully. It would be almost 2 years before Japanese battleships would go into action again off Leyte Gulf. And I think you can ascribe some of this to not only logistical problems, but the effect on morale of the loss of these ships at Guadalcanal. Now, the journey of the San Francisco didn't end after the rise of daylight on November 13th. I mentioned the sinking of the Juno. It was a spectacle that no man will ever forget, to see the torpedoes pass in front of their bow, steam about 300 yards over there, hit a ship, secondary explosion in the magazine, and next thing you know, the ship is gone. The Juno disappeared in a brown pall of smoke, and for about 90 seconds there were chunks of metal and gun turrets and gun barrels and unspeakable other things raining out of the sky onto the other American ships. There were men in the San Francisco who were wounded by the detritus of the Juno dropping out of the clouds. 10 survivors out of 700 men. So, the terror of this spectacle. And now we have the return from action. This picture here is actually in San Francisco Harbor. The crew are standing and posing for cameramen on small boats coming out with their news cameras. But as the crew manned the rail, thousands of Bay Area residents greeted them, jamming the hillsides and promenades to have a look at this battered ship entering the harbor. The story had yet to be told, but everybody knew it was the San Francisco, and the ship's damage was evident. Eugene Tarrant remembers the cool weather that welcomed their homecoming and the fog that held the Golden Gate Bridge like a midnight pall off Savo. It was a publicist's dream, the veterans of the hero ship returning to the city where she'd been built in Vallejo, right next door to the hometown, Oakland, of the admiral who had died in battle on her bridge. The cruiser was hitched to the bollards at Pier 16, and when her ambulatory survivors were transferred to the Oak Knoll Naval Hospital and later bused downtown for a ticker-tape parade, a reporter said, they gave the city a strange feeling of humility and sadness and at the same time its greatest thrill in many a year. A San Francisco Chronicle reporter reported on the procession of survivors stretching out for more than a mile, attended by a crowd of 75,000. Some of the marchers proceeded with canes and crutches, wearing hospital robes. However, the mood of the celebration was peculiar, the reporter said. It was said to be the quietest parade the city had ever seen. But none of the returning sailors stayed thirsty that night on Market Street. Admiral Nimitz was on hand, as well as Admiral King, to award medals for valor. They decorated Bruce McCandless with a Medal of Honor, the young officer who took the con of the San Francisco and steered her out of harm's way. The father of Daniel Callahan drove over from Oakland, but the late Admiral's mother and widow stayed home. In Washington, President Roosevelt himself had just given the Medal of Honor to family representatives of Admiral Callahan, as well as Admiral Scott's relatives. Herbert Schoenland and the San Francisco's heroic firefighter Reinhard Kepler received the Medal of Honor as well. This is a picture of Bruce McCandless with Admiral Callahan's father, I believe. For the rest of the crew, there was a claim to go around, although many of them understood it was excessive. In the press, we were lauded beyond all reason, Clifford Spencer wrote. Most everyone knew that other ships, including the Sterett, Monson, Barton, Juneau, and Atlanta, had suffered far heavier proportions of casualties, but weren't able to return for ticker tape and free beer. The return of the San Francisco was a reminder that the glory that was won and the price that was paid by all to win the fight for Guadalcanal. The losses and sacrifices were significant, not only by the Marines, but by the Navy, who lost nearly 5,000 men over the course of the entire campaign, a ratio of just about 3 to 1 for the killed in action ashore. 3 sailors killed in action at sea for every man who died on the island. So please remember this next time you visit Land's End, and stand beside that piece of the ship all shot up with Japanese shrapnel. It barely captures the horror of what took place that night.